Hey programmers, welcome back. In this tutorial, I want to teach you about the React framework. If you're a JavaScript developer trying to pick up React as a new skill, I got you covered in this video. We'll go over all of the fundamentals of React. But likewise, let's say that you're a developer who's already familiar with React, but just looking for some more practice, I think you will still find value in this video. And so what I have planned for this one is actually constructing a little project, and along the way, we'll go over all of the React basics. So before we jump into this one, I do want to note that in this tutorial, I'm going to assume that you know JavaScript, and you probably know a little bit of HTML and CSS, but of course you don't know any React, right? So with that out of the way, let's jump right in. So what I have planned for this project is a little gadget that kind of mimics a file tree viewer that you would see in like your text editor. So here I have the finished React app running. You can see that it has two folders at the start. I have my desktop and applications, and one feature that we'll have is of course opening these folders. And inside we can nest other files or also other subfolders as well, which themselves could have other folders or files inside. A few things you'll want to notice here. Of course, these folders can be open and closed, so that'll be something we need to implement in React, as well as we'll have different like icons for these files. What we'll also be able to do is change the name of our folders and files, right? So I can change the name of this desktop folder and also this folder over here, and really any of these files inside. Now that we have this goal in mind, let's go ahead and set up our development environment. So if you don't have it installed already, you're going to need to install Node.js. It is a prerequisite for React, right? And what it is just a JavaScript runtime. So if you don't have Node.js installed, and you just want to install the LTS version, I recommend, and click through that installation. It's pretty straightforward. Once you have Node.js installed, you'll want to hop into your terminal because that's actually where we'll utilize Node. In your terminal, I recommend changing directories into some working directory that you're comfortable with housing all of these React files. So I'm just in this projects folder. And what I want to do now is run the command npx create -react-app. Then I'll leave a space and actually enter the name of this application. I'll just call it my file tree gadget. So for my folks who never used Node before, let's actually break down this command before I run it. So npx stands for node package execute. What it's going to do is, of course, execute the node package. And the package here that we're running is create React app. So create React app is a node package actually written by the authors of React. And what it does is install and set up all of the dependencies and boilerplate we need to actually get off the ground and actually begin a kind of blank React project. And here what we're doing is just creating the project with the name file tree gadget. So once you do that, just hit enter. It may take a few minutes to install. Once Create React App is done running, you will have a new directory with the name of the folder that you specified, right? What I want to do is cd into that folder, and this is where we'll spend all the time for this tutorial. So there are a few things inside. What we'll want to do to get going is really just run npm start. What it does is just run the application using all of like the default stuff already inside. And we'll just take a look at what that looks like. So it's going to run in my browser. Looks like by default it goes to localhost 3000. So this is just what Create React App gives us by default. And what I'll do now is open up this folder inside of my code editor. And I'm going to be using VS Code for this one, but of course you can use any editor that you like. So this is on my desktop inside of my projects folder. Go into this gadget file where I have all of this React code that was kind of given to me for free by Create React App. I'll just open up my text editor. So what I'll do to start is actually remove some of the initial React code that we got for free from Create React App. Now we can go over the React stuff on our own. So I'll hop inside of source, which houses all of our JavaScript, so really all of our React code. And so I'll delete some files inside of the source directory. And I think I'm going to delete all of the CSS files. And also looks like there's some like SVG file, which is probably the spinning logo. And I think that will get us running, right? Of course, as soon as I do that, it's going to break the application, but that's okay. I'll just strip out everything that we don't have access to anymore. So what I'll do is I'll remove inside of app.js, I'll remove the logo and the app CSS. So we don't need that. What I'll do is also take out all of this code that this app function returns. I'll just have it return the string hello, right? Nothing crazy over here. And also in index.js, what we'll also need to do is take out the CSS as well. And I think this will be all we need to get going, right? So I changed app.js to look like this. So I basically took out everything and changed the return line to just return the string hello. And then in index.js, I removed the CSS file that was imported before. And I think let's start over here. All right, so let's jump in. So first thing you'll see is I actually see the hello printed out on my web page, which is pretty interesting. And how does that actually happen? Let's get into how React actually hooks into this web page. So if you look at this source directory, there is no HTML file inside of this. Of course, somewhere there has to exist some HTML file because this is some web page, right? You're actually going to find that inside of public. And if I go inside of my index.html, has all of this stuff that we kind of got from Create React App. And what I just want to emphasize is this tag over here on line 31. We have a div with an ID root. And so what React is going to do is actually inject the entire React app into this tag over here. So let's hop around. Let's go into the index.js. If we look inside of the index.js file inside of the source directory, this is actually the entry file for our React apps. So let's trace through this file starting at the very top. So at the top, we have some basic imports for the actual React module. So we have React and separately React DOM. And so for this first module just called React, you're going to need to have that module in scope whenever you actually write React code. We'll kind of see that later on, but basically to write code like this from lines 7 through 9, where we write like stuff that kind of looks like HTML, we're going to need React in scope. And in the same way, React DOM we use in this file just for the sake of using this render function. And I'd say typically in any like basic React app, you're going to have this boilerplate code in some sort of an entry file, just like our index.js. So if we jump a little further, I want to draw our attention to line 10. Looks like we do some vanilla JavaScript stuff here. We just do a document get element by ID, and we find the element with the ID root, which if you remember is this particular div. And so what this code is doing is actually taking that div with the ID root and it's injecting into it our React app. Looks like we have our app running in strict mode. Strict mode isn't too important right now. Really what it does is just give you some additional warnings as you code your React. So where does this app tag come from? Well, that comes from our app file, or our app.js file. So let's hop into that one. And that's actually the function that returns some string right now, which for some reason, whenever I change this string, of course, changes the page. Create React App is awesome because it'll also set up watching of your files and it'll actually hot load them. So if I edit this file and I save it, it will actually refresh and I can preview these changes inside of my browser immediately. So let's go over some basic terminology. You may recognize this thing from your fundamental understanding of JavaScript as just a JavaScript function, and it really is. It's kind of particular because it has a capitalized name, although having a capital letter inside of a JavaScript function name is totally valid, right? So that's nothing special. In the React sense of things, we call this function a component. A component is really like the basic unit in React. So a React component is really just a JavaScript function that returns something to be rendered on the screen. When I say rendered, I just mean like thrown up and viewed and shown on the screen. So here I can render a regular string, just represents some text in my document over here. What I can also do is return or render some HTML tags. So let's say I made this in H3. We'll throw that into the mix. And we'll render that as some plain old text. And of course, because this is like going to render as HTML, we will have those default styles that come with headers, right? So we should get some nice boldness over here. So a React component can return most valid HTML. So maybe I'll switch things up over here. We can have a little more complicated of a return value. I'll return a div with an H3 and also an H4 inside. And I'll have some different messages. So here I'll just say goodbye. Make sure you spell goodbye incorrectly. So let's trace through the order of events over here. When we start up our React app, the first thing that's going to run is our entry file, which is our index.js. If I look inside of index.js, really the important thing that happens is we make this call to get element by ID. What we do is we look for the ID root. And when we get the root element, that would be grabbing this particular div from our index.html. And then at that point, we're actually going to inject our React app into that div. So basically this div will now contain all of this HTML that our app returns, right? So how can we actually bear witness to that? Let's go inside of my Chrome, and if I open up my DevTools, open up my Chrome console, and I want to look at the elements. I'll kind of step through the structure of my document. So if I look inside, here I see my root div, right, which is this thing over here. If I look at this root div inside of my public HTML file, it looks like there's nothing inside. But if I look at that same div inside of my Chrome developer console, if I go inside of that root div, it actually contains my React app. Notice that this div I see of like H3 and H4 is actually exactly what my app component returns, or what my app component renders. All right, so now that we have a better idea of what happens behind the scenes when you render a component, let's actually flesh out some more components. The key thing that I want you to take away right now is when you have a React component, it's really just a JavaScript function that returns something to be rendered, typically some like HTML, right? So let's create another React component, which really just means creating another JavaScript function. So you can use any valid JavaScript function syntax that you like. It looks like here they use by default the plain old JavaScript function syntax. You can also use an arrow function, which I'll decide to do over here. So I'll create a component called folder, and I'll make it an arrow function. Cool. Now let me have this function or this component just return something basic right now. I'll just have it return an h4, and I'll just say folder. Let me start by actually rendering this very simple component. What I can do is maybe inside of my app component, render a folder. So how do I render this component? You see that it's a function, but what you should not do is like call it like a function. That'd be a little silly. What you'll want to do is kind of treat it like it's some HTML, right? So pretend you have a tag called folder. So I'd write it like this. What you can also do is self-close this tag with a slash like this, right? So this means that inside of my app component, it in turn is going to render my folder component. So let's save this code. I should have my folder as well. And of course, if I step through my DOM a little bit, hop inside of my root, inside of my app, I also see the folder inside. And again, the key trick here is whenever we render a React component, we're kind of just rendering whatever it returns, right? Following that like function behavior. So far, we've been really emphasizing that a React component is really just a JavaScript function. That actually gives us a lot of advantages, right? What advantages do just plain old functions have? Well, for one, we can reuse them. So if I wanted to, I can render a component multiple times. So here I have 3 folders now. Let's kind of simplify this code a little bit. So I'll take out these H3s and H4s. We'll just have these folders. And kind of like in my initial demo of the finished application, I want to give these folders different names. So of course, if I change like the H4 on line 12 to like desktop, that won't be any good because that will mean that all of my folders are named desktop, right? So I need this value to be a little more dynamic. Let's kind of take a step in that direction. Inside of my folder component or my folder function, I can write any valid JavaScript code, right? It's really just a function. So let's say I had a variable. So here I'll create a variable. I'll call it the name. And here I'll give it the value of a string, and here I'll say my desktop. And so let's say I wanted to actually utilize this variable name and have it actually render as my desktop. Well, what I can't do is just simply write name. That won't work because if I write that, that will literally just show name, right? So if I want to evaluate this variable as like JavaScript, so evaluate to its value of my desktop, what you're going to have to do is wrap up that chunk or that name in curly braces. If you evaluate these curly braces, the thing within the curly braces will evaluate as JavaScript and not as some plain old text. So now this evaluates to my desktop and not the literal name, right? All right, so now that I'm able to render some like dynamic data, right, I have a variable that I could potentially manipulate. How can I actually have different folders with different names? So if I want multiple folders that have different names, what I need to do is give my component the ability to take in some props, right? So in the argument list, I can take in props. So this thing really just behaves as a regular function argument once you're on the inside of folder. And we'll actually take a look at what it is in a little bit. Props is just the conventional name that we use in React, and I highly recommend that you stick to it. It's a very key concept in React. So let's say I just console.log what this props thing is. So props will always be given to a component, and we'll check its default value. So I'm going to be printing out the value of props. Let me run that, and I'll go into my console. If I look inside, I see an object, right? An empty object. So it tells me that, hey, right now, you're kind of receiving empty props for this lone folder. So how can I actually give this folder some props? Well, where I render the component, so on line 5, basically where I'm kind of like calling the function is kind of the analog here. What I can do is pass it props by just putting names and giving them values, right? So let's say I gave it, I don't know, a food prop, and I gave it the value of cake. And I also gave it a drink prop with the value of coffee, right? So I'll save this code. If I look at the props argument now, it's an object that has that key value pair mapping, right? Food is cake, drink is coffee. And so now we have a way to take in data into a React component. So the analog I kind of have in my mind here is props is how you kind of give arguments or data to a React component, right? So what I want to do here is give my folder a name prop, and I'll give it the value of the name of the folder, right? So I'll call this one maybe my desktop. I'll create another folder with the the name applications. So looking at my app component, I'm rendering my folder twice over, which is why I see my console.log running twice, but of course I have a different name specified every time. So instead of using this name variable, I'll just get that name from my props, right? Props is really just a regular object, so if you want to reference it, you can just say props.name, right? Just using some object notation over here. So let's give that a go. There I have my desktop and applications, right? So now we have a dynamic way to pass data into our components. So let's keep this pattern running, and I'll create another component called file. So in our project, a folder is like an entity that can contain other things. A file cannot contain other things, right? So a file would be something like cat.png, right? It'll be like an actual file image. And so let's have this file take in props as well. I think for now it'll be mostly the same. So maybe we'll use a different type of tag for our files. That way we can just tell the difference. So I'll make them maybe like H5s. Here I'll also say the name of this file, right? So that means when I render my file like up here, I can just use that like HTML similar syntax. I'll give it a name and I'll just call it like dogs.jpg, right? So maybe it's like a photo of some dogs. So there I see my dogs.jpg. Maybe I want to make this a little more dissimilar. So I'll just make this a div maybe and kind of have some like that default text style on that dog. There we go. So maybe we'll also have cats.png. And so it's evident that we can render some components, but for the sake of our application, we have this pattern or this kind of logical pattern where a folder can contain other things. How can I mimic that inside of my React code, right? So here's what you can do. Let's say inside of my desktop folder for now, instead of using the self-closing version of this tag, instead of using the slash over here, you can actually close the tag with like a separate fragment. And here I'll say folder like this, kind of like how I do for like regular HTML with like this div. And you actually put some stuff inside, right? So between this pair of folder tags that represent my desktop, I'm just gonna write some data inside. I'll just say some stuff. And I'll save this code, and I wanna take a peek at where that actually appears inside of my folder components. What I'll also do, let's say, is console.log the props again. We'll see what that looks like. So I'm printing out the props for both of my folders, right, my desktop and my applications. Notice that my desktop now has a separate prop called children, which we kind of got for free, right? I didn't explicitly pass in any children prop, but children is going to be populated with what you put in between the pair of tags that represent that component, right? So I have children of some stuff. And you could put anything you wanted inside, right? So let's say I had multiple things. So maybe I had, I don't know, like an H3 of some stuff. I also had an H4 in a very similar way. So focusing in on just my desktop component, notice that I have two things inside of it. And now if I look inside of the props of my desktop, the children prop is now an array of those two things. If you kind of peek inside of what they actually are, they're kind of like these special React things, kind of why they look a little intimidating, but for all intents and purposes, they do render just like regular H3s and H4s if I actually rendered them, right? Right now, you'll notice that I'm not rendering some stuff and other things. Because if I look at what my folder renders, it just renders the name in an H4. So let's say I switch things up over here. Maybe I'll make this a div. So we'll just have the plain old text of this stuff. And now inside of this div, not only will I have the name, but apparently I can also represent some of the children. And so maybe down here I'll interpolate and I'll just say props.children. Notice that my desktop is indeed actually rendering its children of the H3 and the H4. And so what I can do is actually render anything as children inside of a React component. So why don't I actually bring these other React components inside, right? So instead, I'll put these two files inside of my desktop folder. So I can have this sort of structure, right? And it's kind of hard to see that, hey, these dogs and cats are actually inside of my desktop. Maybe I'll show you how to do some really, really quick like React styling inline. So looking at my folder, where I have the div opening tag over here, you can actually give it a style prop where you can have basically an object that represents like the CSS styles. So let's say I'll have like some really quick and dirty style. So I'll say, I don't know, some border style. And I'll make it an object and we'll have a border of, I don't know, 2px solid pink. So this is just one way that we can kind of use like JavaScript to implement some CSS styling. What I'll do is I'll now pass in this object into that style prop. So a few things you'll notice here is like border style is indeed just a regular JavaScript object where it has the key of border, which of course is like special in React, as well as the value of a valid CSS style. And when I pass in this prop, you need to actually pass it in as an object. So you're going to need to use that curly brace syntax. So wherever you see these orange curly braces on my screen, that actually means we're evaluating like JavaScript, right? So this evaluates as a JavaScript object. It's totally equivalent as writing it all in line like this, right? So you could actually write this if you wanted to, which maybe I'll prefer it that way. So all of my folders will have a solid pink border around them. And you see that this first desktop folder does indeed contain my dogs and my cats, right? Applications doesn't contain anything right now. So next thing maybe I'll work on is maybe adding some indentation to really show like the nested nature of this code. So it's kind of hard to visually see without like the border that dogs and cats are inside of my desktop. Maybe for the children, I'll indent them some. So what I'll do is I'll kind of wrap my children in a div. And what I'll do is give that div some style. So maybe I'll kind of copy this pattern. And for my children, every folder will indent its children with some margin, let's say. Maybe I'll say like margin left. And I'll give it like, oh, it's a good number here, like 17 pixels on the left. We'll see how that looks. All right, so now it's more evident that, hey, dogs and cats are inside of my desktop. And I think at this point, it's probably clear enough for me to actually drop this weird pink border. All right, so this concept of having a React component rendering multiple children is actually a really powerful pattern, because what it lets us do is use components in ways where we can like design and compose them together to establish some pretty complex logic, right? My folder and my file individually might have different and individual logic, but when I compose them together in this way, just by looking at this chunk of code from 5 through 8, you can really understand what's happening, right? I have a folder that contains 2 files. So let's extend this further, right? What would be really cool is if I had other folders inside of my desktop. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll create another folder over here. And maybe I'll call this one music. We'll populate it with some other things, right? So let me give it some other files. So I'll give it some songs. We'll give it All-Star, Classic, Karaoke Song. And just for fun, I'll also throw down another song file. There we see our new music folder inside of our desktop. So now that I have this cool structure to play around with, what I want to work on now is giving my folders the ability to open and close, right? How can we accomplish that behavior? So looking at my folder component, let me take out this console.log. We don't need that anymore. That was just for debugging. So what does it mean for a folder to be open and closed, right? Well, when a folder is open, it should show everything that is inside of it. When a folder is closed, it should not show anything inside of it, right? A closed folder really just shows up as its folder name, right? And so if I think about props.children, right? Props.children actually represents all of the contents of that folder, right? So if I look at my desktop, props.children is this entire chunk, right? It's the music folder, all of its contents, as well as the dogs and cats, right? So what I can do is give my folders the ability to conditionally render their children, right? When the folder is open, I'm going to show the children. When the folder is closed, I won't show the children. Maybe to stub out this feature, what I'll do to start is maybe just give my folders that additional prop, right? So up here, I'll give this a prop of like maybe is open, just to play around with it. And I'll pass in an actual Boolean. So let me pass in, let's say, false this time, right? Notice that I want the isOpen prop to be the false Boolean value. So that means I have to use that JavaScript interpolation syntax over here using those curly braces. Now, of course, that means if I look inside of this folder, it should have that additional prop, right? So here I have the isOpen false prop for my desktop folder. Then from there, I can use that to maybe switch off some conditional logic, right? So inside of line 25, right, I can write any valid JavaScript over here, right? So I can even write an inline ternary. It's a very common pattern in React. So what I'll maybe say is I'll say props.isOpen. And if that's true, then I'll render the children, right? So I'll render these children. Otherwise, I'll render nothing. And to render nothing, what you can do is actually just use null in React, right? So when you render a null value, that just means like don't show anything. So let's see what we get now. So bear in mind that isOpen is set to false right now. So when I run this code for my desktop at least, right, I don't see any of its children. But if I set this to true, that means I would now see the children, right? So that gives me a sort of baseline for mimicking the opening and closing behavior of files and folders. So what I want to do before we go any further and actually make this like interactive with the user is clean up some of this code. So you'll notice that if I look at my folder component, right, I'm referencing props a lot, right? So I say props.name, props.isOpen, and props.children. So a very common React pattern, or really just JavaScript pattern, is just destructuring the props object. So what you can say is destructure out of props the name, the isOpen prop, and also the children prop. You can take that from the props object. So let's say that you're not familiar with that syntax. I can kind of walk through that really quick. So let me open up a quick node REPL session that we can mess around with. So the syntax that I'm using here is really nothing fancy, but maybe you've never seen it before. But let's say I had an object, right? So I have an object with some stuff inside. So I have like a name of Alvin. Cool, so that's an object. What you can do is actually pluck out individual key value pairs from that object as variables, right? So I can say things like let my name and also my job be taken from this object, right? And that'll pluck out those specific key value pairs as those variable names, right? So that's all we're doing over here. That way I don't have to repeat props every time, right? Basically just saying props.name, props.isOpen, and props.children. Now I want to work on giving the user the ability to open and close these folders just by clicking on them. And so to do this, I'm going to have to refactor my code a little bit and leverage another concept in React. So right now we have our open and close control really tied to this isOpen prop. But if I want this Boolean value to change during the runtime of my application, I'm going to have to use some state here. And so to start, what I'll do is at the very top when I import, we'll need to import something additionally from the React module. So I'll put a comma and we need to destructure out of the module the useState hook. And we'll explain what this is in a moment. So what I'll do to start is down inside of my folder component, I'll actually take out where I pass in the isOpen prop. We'll no longer take that in as a prop, so I'll remove it from over here. And instead, we want to make isOpen a piece of state, right? So at the tippy top of my folder component, what I'll do is I'll call this useState function that I get from the React library. And what I'll do is I'll pass in some initial value. Right now, I'll pass in false, right? So useState is a function. Let's just see what this function returns. It's pretty interesting. So I'll console.log this. So right now I'm getting an error because I no longer have this isOpen variable or prop defined. So let me just comment out this chunk of code. That way we can just see this debugging console.log. So it looks like useState returns an array, right? It happens to return an array of 2 elements, and it actually always returns 2 elements. The first element of this array is going to be the exact default value that you passed in, right? So if I made this true, that would mean that the first element is true every time over here. And it's actually the case that the second element of this array is a function, which is going to be a very key characteristic of useState. So here's what we'll do. Let's go ahead and save the return value of useState, and we'll kind of destructure it as an array because I get 2 elements every time. So what I can say is create a const and destructure out of this array, right? Because this highlighted expression, once it actually returns an array. I'll grab my isOpen piece of state, as well as a function that I can use to set that variable. So I'll call it set isOpen, and it's a very conventional pattern that we kind of have in React, right? Whenever you call useState, you're going to get back a piece of state which you can name appropriately, and then you'll also have a setter function for that piece of state, right? And so at this point, of course, that means now I have separately my isOpen variable, as well as the set isOpen, which is going to be a function. So let's take a look at that, right? I should have 2 things, right? I have my Boolean as well as a function. Don't worry about how the function looks over here. We'll use it in a little bit. So maybe you're not familiar with this array destructuring concept in JavaScript. It's not particular to React, it's just a general JavaScript feature. So let me walk through it right now. So I'll go ahead and open up my node REPL once again. And I'll create a quick array. So we'll just say array equals some elements 1, 2, 3. What I can do is unpack this array into individual variables. We call it destructuring the array. So I can say let's say a comma b equals the array. That means the first element is going to be saved in A, and the second element is going to be saved in B, and I kind of forego the third element. So we're just using that same behavior inside of our React code, where the first element is a Boolean value, in this case true, and the second element is a function. All right, so now that I have at least the plain old Boolean value, I can use that as the basis of operating my conditional render of my children. So I can bring this code back in. So right now isOpen is going to default to true, which means looks like my folders are open, right? The desktop is open and music is open. It also looks like applications is open, but I actually don't have any content inside of it. There's no children over there. So what's the point of this setIsOpen function? Well, I can use it to change the value of the isOpen state, right? And when I change the state of a component, it will actually re-render or redraw the component on the screen with a potential change, right? I think for now what I'll implement is when the user clicks on like the name of the folder, then we'll toggle like the open and close of the actual folder contents, right? So around this like name, a value that I have interpolated, let me go ahead and put it around a span. That way I can actually make it kind of clickable. So I'll move this inside. So span is just a regular HTML tag, right? So React's really awesome because it affords you some additional props that you can pass into some HTML tags, right? So for this span, I can give it an onClick. Notice how I'm capitalizing the C in this. This is a reserved prop inside of React. And I can give it a value, and it's going to basically be the click handler on this span, right? So an event's going to fire whenever someone clicks on this span. What I need to do is actually pass in a function. So above, I think what I'll do is I'll create a kind of function separately. So I'll say const, I'll just call it handle click. This is also a pretty common pattern in React where you have like an on click handler, you're going to have a handle click. And what I'll do is for now, won't do much. Maybe I'll just console.log clicked, right? That way we can see when this event triggers. So I'll say clicked. What I'll do is I'll pass in this entire function as a prop to onClick, right? So I'll say handle click over here. So a really important thing to note, I need to make sure that I pass in an actual function into this onClick, right? So handle click, I'm not calling inline, right? So if I called onClick over here, that would mean that I'm actually passing the return value of this function, which is not going to be useful, right? I want to pass in the actual function itself, so I can just write it like this. Cool. So I have my console open, and let me go ahead and click on some of these folder names, right? So I'll click on desktop, right? There I have my event firing. It's actually going to run this function or this callback, if you're familiar with some JavaScript, whenever we click on any of these folder names. So that's pretty useful. Of course, inside of this function, now I want to implement some logic that will actually set the open. So what I'll do is I can call setIsOpen. So when I call the setIsOpen function, I can pass in a new value that I want to be for the isOpen slice of state. Now it's very obvious why useState returns an array of things, right? The two elements are very coupled because I have a value and also a function I can use to change that value. And so it looks like by default, my folders are going to be open, right? Because I have true over here. So let's say when I click it, we set it to false, which would mean just closing the folder. So I'll save that. And now if I hop into my browser and if I click on a folder like music, it will indeed close, and I can also close the desktop. But from that point, it's going to stay closed because if I click on it again, right, I'm just going to keep setting it to false, but it's already false. So you actually want this to act like a switch where I kind of flip-flop between true and false. So I can use a very common programming pattern, right? So what I can do instead is always set isOpen to its opposite, right? So if it's currently true, then I'm going to set it to false. If it's currently false, then I'm going to set it to true. So that's as simple as saying set isOpen to not isOpen, right? Don't be fooled here. Let's say at the very start, my folder is open, so I know isOpen is true. When someone clicks, this function is going to run, which means that we're going to have this value as not true, which really just means false. And I'd be setting isOpen to false, right? So let me save this code. And now let's do some clicking around, right? So I'll click on music, click on it again. I can actually open and close these folders. Pretty neat stuff. So this is a really key pattern in React where we have an event handler that we pass in as a function, right? And please make sure that you do pass in a function. There are a few other ways you may see this pattern written, right? So since I have a very simple function, it only does one thing. What I can actually do is drop the braces and just write it all on a single line. Of course, that still works, so I can still open and close these folders. And sometimes you may even see people kind of skipping the additional name for the function. And you can pass in the function definition right in line. Do be sure to actually put this within curly braces, right? Notice how these are orange because I need to evaluate this as JavaScript and actually have a function, right? So this is another fine way to pass in a function into a handler like an onClick, right? So I think for mine, I'm actually going to keep it as a separate variable just because I kind of like it as a separate name. And when it comes to these different handlers like onClick, there are a lot of other ones, and they all start with on. There's also like an onHover, which you can probably gather what it does. Whenever you hover over an element, it is going to trigger the handler. So just working in some terminology here, we're using useState. State is like information in your React component that when you change it, it will trigger a re-render, right? So it's going to redraw the component. We also say that useState is a React hook. So there are many hooks in React. They're all functions that start with the prefix use. And really the common behavior is that when these functions are called inside of your component, potentially down the line, it could trigger a re-render of your component, right? So for the sake of my useState hook, whenever someone clicks, now it's going to cause a re-render of my component because the isOpen value has changed. All right, so let's keep it rolling. Right now I want to work on making this a little more aesthetic. So what I'll do is work in some CSS. I'm not going to write too much CSS in this one. We'll probably just use like a pre-baked CSS library. One of my most favorite ones is Semantic UI. So we'll just use this quick library and we can just pop it in. So what I'll do is I'll look for Semantic UI CDN. So here I Googled Semantic UI CDN. A CDN is just a quick way that I can quickly drop in some library code into my project. If you've done some JavaScript development before, you probably already have used some CDN. So I'll click on this first link. And once I'm on the Semantic UI page, I want to hop into CSS because we just want some CSS. A lot of things here. I'll just choose this very last one, semanticmin.css. And I'll go ahead and copy the link tag. It doesn't really matter which kind of link tag you copy. What I want to do is hop into my index.html and just drop in this link tag. And that'll actually give me access to this CSS file. So I'll save that. If I look at my React app, notice that I immediately get some initial style. Looks like I have some better font over here. And what we'll do is start working in some maybe icons to represent our folders and files. So back inside of my app, I'll start to reorganize things over here. If we hop around like the Semantic UI library, I'll look for some icons I can use. And I already have some chosen. And so there are a lot of icons here. I'll just look for a nice folder icon. So I think this folder looks pretty neat. What I'll do is I'll right click and I'll inspect the page. And what I can do is just look at that particular element. So where was that folder? Here it was. I'll click on that. And it looks like to actually get that icon, I just give it a class of folder icon. All right. So what I'll do is I'll actually copy that. So maybe inside of my line 24, maybe what I'll do is move this name outside of the span, and I'll only have the folder open if they click on the actual icon, right? So between the span, what I'll do is I'll create my icon, and I'll give it this particular CSS class, right? So it looks like I have to say class of folder icon. And so this is actually a really important thing, kind of gotcha when it comes to React. So if you're familiar with HTML and CSS, you know that class is really just the standard thing we use to reference a class from an external CSS file. So let me save this code. If I go to my React app, now I'm getting an error. It says, warning, invalid property class. Did you mean class name? So in React, whenever you want to apply a CSS class, you actually can't just use class. You actually have to say class name. And the reason is class is actually reserved for something else in React. So that's a small change we'll have to make. It looks like we got rid of the error in that way. And I also see my nice little folder icon over here. So what I'll do is maybe I'll make this blue. So it's as simple as saying blue folder icon if you're using Semantic UI, which is pretty sick. What I'll also want to do is maybe implement a little arrow next to the folder. And so what I'll do is I'll maybe just copy this a little bit. I'll break a line. And not only will I have my folder icon in the span, but I'll also put like an arrow. So that would be a caret. Nice. So they'll give me a caret. I actually have to give it a direction, I think. So I'll say caret right. So there I have a right pointing arrow, it looks like. I think it would be pretty neat if we actually change the direction of this arrow depending on whether or not the folder is opened or closed, right? So that's a caret right. And maybe when it's open, it should have been like a caret down. That would have been cool, right? And so let me actually show you how you can implement some like conditional changing CSS based on some state, right? So I know I need to leverage this isOpen value. So it's really simple. What I can do is maybe up here, I can write a ternary. So I'll say const direction. And I'll say a ternary where dependent on whether or not isOpen is true, when it's true, then I want my arrow, I think, to be down, right? Kind of like pointing to all of the contents below it. And if isOpen is false, then I want it to point to the right. So what I have right now is really just a variable that contains some string of down or right. And I can use that inside of this string that I pass into class name, right? So the first thing I'll need to do is actually do some interpolation here, right? Because right now I'm passing in a string, and if I want to evaluate a variable name, you know I need to use those curly braces, right? So I'll do that over here. And I'll also throw down some JavaScript string interpolation. So instead of using double quotes, I'll use backticks. And now within this string, what I can do is use a $sign and some more curly braces, and I can write some value I want to evaluate, right? So here I'll write direction. And again, this particular thing of using like backticks, that's not a React feature. That's just how we can do string interpolation in JavaScript. So let me save that. So right now my folders start open, which means that my arrows begin pointing down. But when I close a folder, right, they point to the right and they keep flipping back and forth, which is pretty cool, right? So I'm really just using this is open value or this is open slice of state again and again to kind of have my code, or the way it looks, kind of react to what's happening in my code. All right, so it looks like my file tree is really starting to take shape. What I'll work on now is adding some icons for my different files. And I think what we'll do is we'll render different icons depending on what type of files we have, or really what the file name is, right? So MP4s are like audio files, so maybe I'll have like an audio icon, and JPEGs and PNGs are images, so maybe I'll show an image icon. So let's do that. I know that when I actually have my files, they all take in a prop of the name where we have like the extension of the file listed out over here. So I'll want to reference that. And I can really focus my attention now just on this small file component, right? So we'll make this a little larger. So for now, I don't think we need to add any state to the file component. We just want to reference these props. And what I want to do is just look at the thing after the dot in the props.name, right? So I think what I can do is I'll take the props.name. Maybe I'll start by destructuring things over here. So I'll say const name equals props, just like we did before in our folder component. And I can just reference name now, because I'm going to reference it twice over. And what I can say is, all right, for the name, let's say I took that string and I split it. And so when I do name.split, I'll split it on a dot. And that would separate everything before the dot from everything after the dot, right? So it'd give me an array of two things. I want to reference the second element, so that'd be index 1. And I'll save that as like my type of extension. So I'll say const, I'll say file extension. So file extension would be a string like MP4, JPEG, or PNG. Let me save this code. Maybe we'll actually step through that pattern a little bit. So jumping into my node repo, let's say we had a string and it was all started at MP4. Now that I have the string variable, I can do string.split, of course. If I split it on a dot, I'm going to get an array of everything around those dots. So I have separated basically all star from the MP4, and here I'm just referencing the second element of that array, which of course is just the MP4. Cool. And what I can do is now use that file extension to kind of switch off some logic for what icon I want to render, right? So I think what I'll do is I'll use like an object to kind of map the file extension to the type of icon I want. So let me create, maybe we'll say file icons. And I'll make this an object. And so I'll have the keys be these file extensions. So looking at my example, it looks like I need something for MP4s, also need something for JPEGs, and also PNGs, right? All right, so now that I have these keys, what I'll do is I'll just choose some strings that represent icons from Semantic UI. So I think they're pretty straightforward. They basically have everything in this library. So let me look for, I don't know, headphones would be cool. And for JPEG, that's like an image. So I'll look for any like image looking stuff. I'll just say file image. And maybe for PNGs, I'll use the file image outline. All right, so now that I have an object to quickly determine what icons I should render, depending on what kind of files that we have, I'll just use that inside of the stuff that I return over here. So I think what I'll do is I'll copy this icon from before, since we already have some value interpolated inside of it. And let me clean this up. So we still need an icon. And instead of direction, we'll go into the file icons object and key into it using our file extension. Right, so we're just using the key to kind of unlock the value. And of course, I don't need to say caret here anymore. Cool, so let's save that, see how things look. It looks like things aren't working because I need a space over here. So let me add a space. Nice, and it looks a lot better. So here I have my different icons depending on whether or not I have like MP4, JPEG, or PNG. All right, programmers, I think this is a good stopping point for this part of the tutorial. In the next one, we'll continue working on some more features for our tree viewer app.